Welcome to episode 5 of the SGS Movie of the Week. This week we are tangling with a very difficult and frankly pretty R-rated movie, Fargo. But that's an esteemed panel of alumni. Marshall Roll and Skyler King are joining us to discuss this R-rated film. Thanks so much for being here, guys.
Yeah, thanks, you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So I rewatched Fargo this week. I loved it. Just like I did in the 1990s when I saw it in the theater. It's great. And usually we get kicked off by Dave, giving us a little bit of historical context about what life was like in the 90s.
Sure. I remember them well.
Fargo.
So Fargo was made in 1996, or it was released in 1996 by Joel and Ethan Coen. They wrote and directed it, as they tend to do. It was up for 7 Academy Awards. Frances McDormand won Best Actress for playing Marge. The brothers also won for Best Original Screenplay. Just as a note, it's been ranked as one of the top 100 comedies of all time, also one of the top 100 films, so something to think about. And the context, in the 1990s, I mean, Bill Clinton was running for re-election in 1996. The Cold War had ended. You know, the economy was doing okay. White radicalism was sort of on the rise after the Oklahoma City bombing. I don't really know what to sort of add as context. I mean, the only other thing I would say is that the movie says it's set in 1987, which is right before the end of the Cold War. Reagan's president. So we might end up thinking about those a little bit. But that's the real basic overview of when it was made.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit before the podcast about whether or not we wanted to do scenes, and we kind of decided we want to go straight to the mailbag. So the first question is from Jane Whitcomb of Spokane, Washington. She asks, did these events really happen in 1987? Where can I find the details? And the simple answer is that the Coen Brothers heard about a similar murder, but that nothing like this happened in 1987. So the big question is, what's the value of sort of faking out the audience in the first frame of the movie by saying this is a true story and the events have been told exactly as they happened out of respect for the dead? It's a hard question, but we've got alumni on the panel, so I'm going to ask, what's the value of sort of shifting the audience's perception of reality at the beginning of the movie? What do we think?
I mean, I think one interesting thing is I did like some light reading on it before this, and I forget which brother said it, but he brought up that even though it's not an actual true story, both the brothers, they set out wanting to make a true story, even if it wasn't an actual true story. They wanted to make a film in the genre of that, which personally I think is kind of like, it kind of takes away from the merit of actual true stories. And I don't know, I just kind of, I feel like it's better off as like kind of like used to like mislead the audience rather than them setting out to like actually want to make something in the genre of a true story. Why not just use an actual true story?
So did you think it actually disrupted your reading of the movie a little bit?
Yeah, since I read that after rewatching it recently, it kind of made me rethink some of the things I saw. I thought that like some of the scenes that they added were meant to kind of like poke fun at the idea of true stories, but then reading that they wanted to set out to make a true story, it kind of like made me second guess those thoughts.
I think that's fair. Does the movie feel real or not? I mean, part of me thinks it's realistic and part of me thinks it's absurd.
I mean, I think that the general idea of like this kind of scheme that Jerry comes up with is like pretty realistic. I could see that like being something that actually could happen. But then they have these scenes that are so outlandish and like these mannerisms with the pretty much all the characters that kind of like it tries to like make an individual viewer kind of go both ways on their opinion.
I agree. Dave and Marshall? Got any?
Marshall, do you have any thoughts, or you want me to?
I pretty much second everything Skyler said. I would also just add that, it does really blur the line between what's real and what's fake and like where fact begins and where fiction ends. And I think that's kind of part of the beauty of the movie itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mostly agree with what Skyler said. I mean, it doesn't bother me so much that it claims to be based on a true story, because I just feel like movies do that all the time now, and they sort of distort the truth. And I also agree with Skylar's point that like they try to present it as like something that actually happened. And I think with some of the scenes that maybe don't advance the plot, like they sort of add to that feel a little bit. I mean, the only other thought I had, and you know, it does not like answer exactly how I feel about it presenting itself as true, but like a lot of the film is concerned with like the lies that the characters are telling each other and like themselves too, right? And so you kind of have like the movie as a whole in some ways is like not real, but it like I did feel that a lot of the things could have happened, right? Like Skylar said. So
One of the things that I read suggested that the film was not a noir film, which is a kind of American film about detectives and crime, but that it was a docu-noir. And one of the things, so it's like it's a noir, but it's got like a documentary feel, and it's not so much a whodunit. It's like a frame by frame description of an actual crime story. So it starts with the inception of the crime, and there's not a lot of fancy camera angles when they're meeting in the bar. It's two shots basically. Them looking at each other and talking it over, and then it's supposed to feel sort of documentary. So, what's the value of a sort of docu-noir film? Does it advance things, or is it an interesting kind of way to think about a crime story, to do it from the inception all the way to the conclusion? I don't know. That's one of the things I wondered about.
Well, in the title card they have, the last line, it says like everything else is exactly how it happened, which in itself is like a crazy bold claim for any true story.
Right.
And with those scenes, I think if they try to make it like, well, each scene itself seems so cut and spliced. Like the transitions are so hard sometimes. Like
Right.
it's like one thing and it's like a completely different thing in like a totally different tone or pace. So if they try to make it like more like a noir film where it like flows together nicely, it may have taken away from that sort of feel of it actually being exactly as it happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think the criminals are terrible, right? The criminals are
Oh yeah.
not only violent, but they're like bad criminals, right? And that actually seems pretty realistic to me. Jerry Lundegaard is not a good criminal, and he's offered lots of ways to basically make $80,000. He could take the finder's fee and make $25,000 at the beginning. No, I just don't like my father-in-law, basically. So it feels real to me, and it feels like a almost Dickensian in its social commentary, even though it's like also absurd. I don't know if people have thoughts about that or.
What do you mean by like Dickensian in its scale? That might help.
So like Dickens like to tell these stories of. So I think of The Wire because David and I love The Wire, but The Wire is like perfectly Dickensian. It's just like it's not about any one person succeeding.
Got it.
Or if the main character dies, like one of the most important, several of the most important characters die in The Wire, but the show doesn't stop because the show is about the society, the fabric of the way that the world works. And I think that that's the case. This is a examination of, the people who live in Minnesota contending with crime rather than like, are we rooting for Jerry to get away with it? No. Or Carl to get away with it? No. We're rooting for Marge probably, but that's about it. All right. Any objections if I go to the mailbag?
Let's do it. Another one.
All right. Next question we've got is from Jerry Stackhouse, an SGS alum, but no relation to the famed Detroit Piston. He asked, why'd you make me watch such a violent movie? What do we think about violence in the film?
There's a lot of it.
Yeah, and even as how violent it is, most of the violence is like, it's hilarious. Like all of the crazy violent scenes, I felt myself just like trying not to laugh at because, I mean, two people are being assassinated, but the way that it's shown, it's like so slow. the guy has like no emotion and that's like almost comical and how he's like chasing after them. Like
So which scene are you talking about? I'm sorry.
the when the two people drive past and see Geyer kill the cop and he goes to chase after him. It's such a long drawn out scene. Not like he's just like smoking a cigarette, nothing's happening. It's like I found it almost comical and like how it was being portrayed, and the guy's just like running away. He runs away for like 30 seconds and like Geyer's just kind of like watching him run, and then he kills him. And it's like it should be just be like this like nerve tingling scene where you're just like terrified of this guy, but it's like I never really felt any like fear toward any of the villains, especially Steve Buscemi. I mean, for like as violent and bad as they are, it's like they're just goofy people.
Marshall?
Yeah,
Agree?
I would agree with that too. And also it kind of goes back to the cops as well, right? When Marge walks up to Geyer, like pushing the foot of the Steve Buscemi character into the wood chipper, and there's blood everywhere, and she like has to wait for him to stop the wood chipper and points to her badge and says police, and then he runs away and you shoot him. It's just like it's the violence is just so strange because it just doesn't feel real. And so I think that's part of the allure of this movie, is that it seems like what's supposed to be like what we're supposed to be like, I don't know, traditional maybe climax or rising action we would see like in the form of like a violent scene. That's just not in this movie. In fact, the violence, like Skyler says, serves more as comic relief. So I think that's an interesting kind of switch.
Do you agree, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. Maybe with some exception, but like I did find myself chuckling at some of the violent scenes, which was then like uncomfortable at the same time. Like I think about when Wade is shot and you see like some of the feathers like come flying out of his coat. Like even Steve Buscemi's character Carl, like the way he's injured is just like absurd, but it's also incredibly like painful to watch him in those scenes afterwards. I do think like some of the scenes of violence that I guess they are still comical in some ways, but they are kind of horrifying as well, is like the kidnapping of Jerry's wife. Right? Like I felt a little more tension there. And even when she was like running away at the cabin, I mean, there's like comedy there. Like the two guys are laughing at her. She's like stumbling away blindfolded. But like, I think in those scenes, I don't know, it felt like there was at times more at stake, but still like the comedy is mixed in. Like they can't break the bathroom door down to like try and find Jean. And then when Geyer gets in there, the first thing he does is like look for a Band-Aid, right? It's not
I
like,
need ungoods.
Anyway, Chad, what about you?
I mean, I don't know. I actually kind of thought you all were going to go a different way with this. I mean, I'm not sure I thought that the violence was funny. I was reading today that, like, when Pulp Fiction came out, there was this massive outcry about violence in the film. And other movies, the John Woo movies in the 90s, like Face Off. There's another John Woo movie, I can't remember. But those are, like, extremely violent, and those drew a bunch of critical reaction about, like, violence in movies. But actually, Fargo is probably more violent, but sort of passed through conservative circles without really any comment. And maybe it's because the violence is not
Totally gratuitous.
Or gratuitous. Some people said that the violence in the Quentin Tarantino movies was pornographic. But, I read the scene where Wade is killed. It's very interesting. It's like he's murdered, and it's like a couple of feathers. It's not actually violent at all. They go into his parka, and, it's like it could easily be a PG-13 or even a PG film. And then he shoots back, and Steve Buscemi suffers this horrifying, like, neck wound. And, 10 minutes later, he's digging through the snow along the fence line in the famous scene with an ice scraper, and his hands are, covered in caked blood. And he's got the weird thing that he's peeling off his face. So I find the violence to be very strange. I guess I think it maybe relates to the realism and absurdity of the film, but I'm not sure I laughed at it. Although he does like kill the guy. He kills Carl with an axe.
That's true.
Paul Bunyan would.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know. I don't know if I have anything to add. I talked a lot, but I don't feel like I added much.
Yeah, I mean, it's just hard to know how to respond to the violence in the film, ultimately, I would say. So.
Yeah, maybe the mailbag will help us.
Yeah, let's turn to it.
All right. Bobby Hunsinger from Newman Lake asks, some have said that Marge Gunderson is the moral center of the movie, but I don't like the way she's so calm in the face of death. What do you think? And so I guess that's probably referring to like her matter of fact, like consideration of the crime scene where she's just like, boom, boom, boom. This obviously was the way it went down. What do we think? Is Marge the moral center of the movie, or is she actually almost as cold-blooded as Carl and Gare?
Yeah, I think the scene that like stuck out to me the most is throughout the movie they keep bringing up how she's pregnant. It's just like, in case the audience forgot, keep bringing it up. And then she comes up and she sees the Sierra next to the cabin she knows that there's people in there who have undoubtedly killed 3 people, 1 officer. And she recently heard news of 2 other people that are dead who she believes they are connected to. Knowing that she's 7 months pregnant, she calls for backup and then just kind of strolls in.
Right.
Like, it's hard to feel compassion for someone who just like completely forgets everything that's going on in their life and just kind of like walks into something so willy-nilly. And I think it's kind of like similar with all the cops. They don't really have any regard for what's happening. Just like, or by putting it in perspective, it's just kind of like they read about something and like, okay, like 3 people are murdered on this highway and 2 officers showed up. And when Marge asks the other officer where everyone is, he's just like, oh, it's cold. Three people are dead. One of their probably friends who's an officer is dead, but it's cold, so it's just us here right now.
Here's some coffee. Let's go get some night crawlers.
Yeah, it's just it's such a like, she seems like such a weird character to like look towards as a way to like handle stressful situations or like dire situations such as these. That I don't know. I came out of the movie not really liking Marge at all, to be honest.
I mean, I think that we do kind of see some progression in Marge, though, because in the 2 final scenes, we have her in the back of or I guess 2 of the 3 final scenes, but we have her in the back of the car with the criminal who she just caught, Geyer, and she's talking to him. She's like, it's not all about the money. Why would you just do this for the money? And then she goes back to her husband, and he's really sad that he didn't get on the 29-cent stamp. He only got on the 3-cent stamp. So it's like, she's like, it's not all about the money. So I do think that we see some character growth there. And like, to me, that's like the only growth we see in the whole movie. Like, I'm trying to think of any other character that kind of changes from beginning to end. And I don't really see anyone other than the fact that they're getting killed. So to me, I do think that Marge is, I wouldn't say the moral center, but I would say that she is probably the person who we would want to look to most if we were trying to find someone who comes out of it better.
Yeah, I mean, we could also compare Marge to the guys in the film, right? The guys in the film are disasters. And maybe, the fact that Marge is 9 months or 7 months, and there's this, possibility of new life attached to her pregnancy. Maybe that gives us some insight because, a lot of the film seems to be about sort of insecure men. Does that help us put Marge in perspective or not?
I think that is almost like entirely unique to Marge. I think that pretty much every other character in the movie is insecure about something. Like, I was talking to Marshall last night about almost like every interaction that Marge has with someone that's just like a random Minnesotan. They talk about their like high school experience. Like, that's the only interesting thing that's ever happened in their life. And it's pretty much true for every single person. They like Mike knows her from high school. The hookers that she talks to, she like talks about her high school. She's like, "Go Bears," which is like,
Right.
it doesn't make any sense why she's saying this. So I do agree with Marshall that she's like one of the only person to look to for any growth. But even still, it's kind of like, I don't. It's not a high bar to reach. I don't know.
Well, for
Yeah, I mean, I
sure,
think-
for sure not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she doesn't really, like, I was reading some stuff that talks about how she doesn't really fully try to grasp, like, what has happened at the end. Like, two of you kind of mentioned that speech at the end, where she's like, there's more in life than money. And then she basically says, like, I don't understand. And then right after that, she's just like, what a beautiful day, right? And kind of like moves past it, even though it's like a horrible day, right? And so, like, she doesn't really try to wrestle with what's going on. And, like, in some ways, then she can move past it and go back to Norm, right? And talk about the stamps pretty quickly. And so, like, one of the things I read about the movie is, like, it said that this was trying to maintain a stoic community where, like, people maintain, like, norms and values through, like, repetition, even in their interactions. And that, like, gets to some of the language that, like, all the Minnesotans use. I think Skyler liked the mention of, like, referring to high school again and again, sort of reinforcing those bonds. And so, I mean, like, I think that's maybe a different way to think about Marge. And, you know, I would say in the film as a whole, she's the moral center because it can't really be anywhere else except maybe, like, her and Norm together are, like, the moral center. Might be a possibility.
So, what's Jerry's deal then? Like, because, you know, even like Norm, like, you know, as you were saying, I was like, oh, his name's Norm, right? Like,
Right. Yeah.
right. There's something not normal about Jerry. Like, why does he commit the crime? Like, I don't even think he needs the money.
I think the vibe I got from him was the first time you see him try to, like, kind of hustle or scam someone is when he's like
The
selling
true
like,
code.
The true code.
yeah. And then he's they give in to him, right? And I feel like this is something that's probably happened almost every time he does something that's kind of like gets back to the repetition at Holte. Like, he sees that, like, it works, so he keeps doing it. And then very next time you see him selling a car, the guy's like, oh, I don't need the true coat. And he's like, yeah, you don't need that. Even though it's established that it comes like that from the factory. So you know he's just going to do it again.
Right.
And I think that's probably why he, like, goes through with the whole scheme even after he, like, finds out he has the finder's fees, because, like, he realizes, like, it's his plan isn't really working, but then he, like, can't get a hold of the kidnappers, so the plan is actually already in motion. So he's like, oh, I guess it is kind of working, so I will be able to, like, go through with this. But I don't know, I feel like he just kind of falls into his own trap in seeing, like, there's no reason why he should have been successful in almost anything that he does. It's just like everyone kind of caves into him.
Yeah, I mean, my question was, does he even need? He's like, I have money troubles. It's like, does he need $1 million? Like, is there?
Yeah, I don't know. They seem pretty well off. I mean,
They live in a
his
house.
father-in-law is
His dad?
rich. Like, he has the money himself. So if they were, like, falling on hard times, like, his father seems to, like, somewhat love his daughter, even though he's, like, one of those characters that is, like, more obsessed with his money. Like, he wants to whatever. But I feel like he isn't so heartless that he wouldn't help them. But I think he just is just a hustler in nature, and it's just kind of like what he feels like he has to do. I don't think it really is all for the money. He doesn't even really mourn his wife, and he completely forgets about his son
Right.
until he
That's the
realizes that the
horrifying.
plan's in motion. He's like,
Yeah.
oh, have you told your son, or Steve or whatever? He's like, you've told your son what happened? He's like, oh yeah, I have a son. It's like, I don't know.
But then he also, like, even worse is, like, he tries to use his son to, like, get the deal from Wade, right? He's like, I
Yeah.
needed to look after, like, my son. And, like, so he's happy to use his son when he, like, needs him. I mean, I agree with that. Doesn't seem like he needs the money. It seems like he's got a pretty, like, happy family. Like, wife seems nice. Kid seems like a teenager, but, like, decent kid. And so, I mean, he's just got that. I don't know if it's like trying to emulate Wade, who seems like a self-made man, really wealthy. But he's got that insecurity where like that's not good enough for him to have like seemingly a good life, whereas obviously for like Marge, that's good enough. But Marshall, Chad, any thoughts about Jerry?
I mean, I think personally that Jerry's home life is probably not that good because we saw that like the kid Steve like always goes to McDonald's for like 2 hours, even though he like hasn't finished his dinner, and like he goes like out with his friends, and so like it's like impossible for him to like maintain a normal conversation with his parents too. His mom's like getting after him. She's like, "You're a C student, like you should be better," and he's like, And I feel like they're all kind of just going through the motions at some like to some degree, and I mean like to some degree like there are times when everyone kind of just goes through the motions, but I feel like in this film like everyone in that family just doesn't seem particularly well off in the beginning. I just kind of got that just general negative vibe from them, and when I look at it like that, it just me like Jerry's just a guy who's just trying to just like find some meaning to his life. He like family is like not really working out for him, so he's gonna try to get money. I just don't really see Jerry as, it's just so strange, to be honest. I don't really know what to think about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I just think there's something driving him. It's not money, whether it's hatred for Wade, for making him feel small. I agree with Marshall. Like, there's some telltale signs. Like, his wife is really nice, but she's like, man, she is chopping those carrots. Like at the beginning, and then when she's knitting in front of the TV before the weird scene, where it's a cool scene where you have the screen of the TV and she's watching the TV, and then through the other like screen, the other rectangle that you see things through, she sees the kidnapper, and he stands there for a while, and then comes through. But when she's doing that, she's like intensely knitting, and it's like I'm not sure what that intensity is about, whether she's unhappy or that's a signal of her unhappiness, or Jerry's unhappiness, or their unhappiness. But I don't think that the crime spree doesn't start because of money is my take. And I think Skyler's right. It's like you can work the True Coat scam on the dude in the dealership, but when you get involved with Shep Proudfoot's friends, that's a whole different deal. And I think that's sort of where he goes wrong. It's like he's late to the appointment, and he doesn't, he loses their number. Yeah, it's a disaster. And that sort of brings us to a related question, like, what's up with Mike Yanagita? Because I think that's a similar kind of question. And I remember from the 90s when I saw it, my friends and I came out, we were like, what was up with Mike Yanagita? And my friend Ian, for weeks, would be like, you're such a super lady. And he would imitate Mike Yanagita wherever we went. So what's up with Mike Yanagita? I assume that's one of the scenes that you guys were talking about. It's weird. Like, doesn't seem to advance the plot, but might actually be really important. What do we think?
Yeah, I think this scene actually, I think there's like a lot of different ways to take it. It's like just sitting and thinking about it, and I've read like a few different takes on it. Like, it kind of progresses some things with Marge and how she like looks at people, and maybe that's why she starts to like become kind of suspicious of Jerry. Like, before she's trusting of everyone, but then she finds out Mike lied to her, so she's like, oh, maybe Jerry's doing the same. When I first watched it, while I was watching it, I thought he kind of emulated and was almost a caricature of like everyone in Minnesota that has just like been going through the motions and doesn't really know what to do with themselves, and kind of spirals into this mental illness where he's not really receiving any help, and he's creating these delusions of he was married to his old high school friend, even though he's just like stalking her. And I don't know, I feel like there's like, this was like an exaggeration, but I can see like a lot of similarities of him and other people, other side characters in the show kind of living in the past. And there's just like the movie's so bleak, and there's just like every shot outside is just like a long road where you can only see snow. Like when Buscemi's bearing the money, he looks to his left and it's like 30 miles of fence, looks to his right, it's the same. And I feel like that's really what it's like to live in Minnesota. And it's just like this barrenness and this bleakness is just like engulfs all of the residents, and it just comes to show the most in Mike. And kind of this is why it creates these mannerisms. Also, like, kind of unrelated, but like a weird take I saw was like he kind of it to make it seem like it's a true story. All true stories have like these weird characters that are in it for no reason.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just kind of one of those things that are like, yeah, also she met with this guy when she went to whatever city it was. So that happened, but I feel like that's kind of a lame way to look at it, to be honest.
Other thoughts?
I mean, I agree with what Skyler said. I mean, I think the idea that it causes her to question Jerry and what he's been saying is kind of the role it plays. But it is sort of like hard to place within the rest of the film. I mean, I think it's notable that it's like the one time Marge lies. She doesn't like tell Norm that she's going down to meet him. Mm-hmm. And like, that's kind of interesting. And you're sort of wondering like, why is she like not telling her husband about it? And so like, maybe in the long run when we see her back with Norm, like maybe that's a little development for her, right? But yeah, I had trouble placing it. So, other thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I kind of agree with that assessment. I think that it's really out of place with the rest of the movie, and I really don't think that it advances the plot, other than it gives us more insight into Marge's character. And to that end, I would say that, yeah, it is the point at which Marge, like, I think maybe begins to suspect Jerry of lying. But I also think that it's just like, kind of is just a generally crazy experience. And the whole film is just based on these like just crazy, unimaginable experiences, but it is within this context of it being a true story. And so I think it kind of might have to do with that framework of, I don't know, things that could be true, but like aren't.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, if you talk about like, there's this dichotomy in the movie for me. It feels like there's two stories. There's the story of Marge and Norm, and they're like super sweet and nice to each other. And then there's the story of all these criminals who are like awful. And there's also like this extreme violence. But then most of the time, if Jerry Lundegaard is really mad, he's going to say like, "You're darn tootin'," if he's agrees that something terrible has happened. So it's this weird, like, suburban, happy, normal, life set against this extreme violence, against a backdrop of like brutal Minnesota cold. And maybe Mike Yanagita fits into that a little bit for me. And I do think, his lie is so outlandish that there's a very thin line between him and Jerry Lundegaard. They strike me as, having some similar ailment that sort of troubles them. But
at least Mike is like actually good at lying. Like,
true.
As a viewer, like I believe that he married this person and whatnot, and obviously so did Marge. But anytime Jerry's trying to lie, he starts stammering and he's like shaking and nervous, and he like can't look at Marge in the eye, and he's like changing the subject, not answering questions, and then he just runs away. Like, so I think he's like, in a way, he almost shows what like Jerry could have been if he was like actually successful at what he was trying to do, even though like his qualities are like exhibited in like the worst way possible.
I think 100%. So we're under 3 minutes. Last thoughts on the movie. Did we like it? Parting thoughts about it. Anybody want to go first?
I can. I mean, I've never seen it before, and I came into it kind of like expecting like kind of a harsh comedy, but I didn't really find it that way at all. I actually thought it was kind of depressing. It was a lot of just stagnant people not really changing, and in the end, you know, what are we left with as viewers? I think that's a question that like we have to grapple with. So
I liked it. It's been a while since I've seen it. I mean, I think one of the things I read, and I'll just mention it, is like it's kind of a mashup of all these different things. Like it's got noir, it's got the realism, it's got comedy, and so I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard to know what to think about it. It's because it tries to combine all of these different sort of genres while also changing them in a lot of ways. So
Yeah, I loved it too. This was the second time I'd watched it, but I watched it when I was younger, so it almost felt like the first. I didn't remember the movie being like this at all, really, to be honest. And I don't know. I feel like when I told my mom I was doing this and I watched this movie, right? And she was just like, "Oh, that movie I hated that movie." She's like, "It was so weird." And I was like, "I don't know. I love that movie. It was like one of the better movies I've watched in a while." So I thought it was great.
One thing that struck me while I was reading about it is I've always loved the soundtrack. And if you like the movie, I recommend watching the TV series, which is awesome. Season 2 is one of the best seasons of television you'll ever see. But I was reading about the music because it's like there's the absurdity and there's the tragedy, or there's the, violence. And then there's this somber soundtrack. And I found out today that it's a Norwegian folk song with car door chimes set against TV static. And that's how they did the music. And it's perfect for me because it's like about car dealerships, and it's about, in the screenplay, apparently, if you look, when they're talking about the television, they have snow on them. So there's snow inside the places and snow outside. So I think that, the music really sets it apart for me because it's so sad. And I agree with Skyler and others. It's an incredibly depressing movie, and yet I love it a lot. And I actually think when you take Marge Norm, it's kind of a beautiful film too, even though there's a ton of violence.
yeah.
So Marshall and Skyler, we're under a minute, but before